We continue on Sundays trying to go through the book of Genesis. We are at Genesis chapter 23. So go ahead and put your ribbon down there. Genesis chapter 23. We'll meet there and start discussing that in a few moments. Genesis 23 is a chapter of sorrow, but also a chapter of faith. Sometimes we miss the faith application just focusing upon the sorrow that is there. Of course, this is recording the death of Sarah, the wife of Abraham. Death has been described in this chapter, and it can be broken down this way. If you're taking notes separate from your outline that you have in the handout, if you might want to write this down, I came across this and thought I would share it with you just to outline the chapter itself. Death is a time of sorrow. You see that verses 1 and 2. Death is also a time of support. You see that verses 3 through 6. The people in the region are supportive of Abraham somewhat through this time. Death is a time of spending. He's going to purchase a place, a burial plot for his family, for his wife, and for his family in the future. That's verses 7 through 16. And then death is a time of separation. And that's verses 8 and then verses 17 through 20. Time of separation. It's coming to all of us. It's a reality that we all must face. We don't like to think about it. It's morbid. Death is a reality, though, that we all must face. Now, Sarah, of course, is going to pass from this life, and Abraham gives us some insight on how faith can help us through some of those dark times. You look around this room, there's really not a soul here that's of any age of understanding that hasn't been touched by death, the loss of loved ones, friends, close relatives. And it causes people to go through that gambit of grief. Grief is a reality that we must face, and some people let the grief consume them and cause them to do things they shouldn't or not do things they should. And some people press on. That's what we must do. I say this quite often at funerals that I've been blessed to participate in and speaking. I can't really preach anyone's funeral but my own. But death is not something that we can truly be prepared for as much as it's not something we get over as much as it's something we get through. And we have to get through that with God's help and with help from one another as well. So let's talk about dealing with this. How do I prepare for this? We talked about in the last few chapters, God has this, and then I can do this. And now, how do I prepare for this? Abraham's loss. Abraham faced loss, the loss of the loved one, the one that he loved the most. And as I think about that and break that down and contemplate what that must have been like for him, I was looking and trying to figure out exactly how long they had been married, and there's not a genuine consensus on that. Some believe they were married right before they left Ur of the Chaldees, maybe in Haran and so forth, but I'm not sure exactly how long they had been married. I do know this, when we look at the text, we look at verses 1 and 2 of 23, it says, and Sarah was 107 and 20 years old. Love the King James word. 127 years old, right? She was 127 years old, and these were the years of the life of Sarah. And Sarah died in Kirjath Arba, and the same is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. As I look at that, Sarah goes down in history, and you're thinking about that, she goes down in history as the only one whose age is given at her death. Of all the people that are mentioned in the Bible, of all the ladies that are mentioned in the Bible, she goes down in history as one of the most recognizable. I dare say Mary would be the one that would be right above her, but she's going to be right there in that contender list of those who are most recognizable, of people who don't even know the gospel account, who don't know the story of the Bible, if you will. Many of them know the name Sarah, know about her. Yes, she's one of those Bible characters. They might say something like that. If you were to get an average person, if you put it on a game show, it's interesting. If you ever watch a game show and they have a Bible category, some of the answers that they get, we sometimes laugh at that, but many of them could get this one, even if they don't study their Bibles. It was Abraham's wife. It was Sarah. You know that one. But as I say, you consider, though, when you look at this woman and her 127 years on this earth, we're not given a whole lot of insight into her life, are we? I mean, really and truly. We're not told a whole lot about what her youth was like, how she grew up in Ur, what it was like for her as a young girl, so forth. You know what we do have recorded for us? The majority that we have recorded for us is her making mistakes. I mean, think about it. As well known as she is, and given recognition as a faithful person in the book of Hebrews 11, verse 11, we'll see later on, but consider the majority of the events recorded in her life are mistakes. She laughed twice at the idea of having a child in her old age. She lied twice. Think about this. I know Abraham's the one told her to do that, told her to lie to Pharaoh, told her to lie to Abimelech. She was listening to her husband, but she lied nevertheless. Even Abimelech would make that point very clear. Even she told me she was his sister. So she was involved in that. That's a negative thing, definitely. All liars will have their part in the lake which burns with fire, Revelation 21, verse 8. It's a serious thing to lie in God's eyes, but she did twice. We have that recorded for us. She laughed, didn't trust God, but she was the one that had the idea of Hagar, wasn't she? That wasn't Abraham's idea. She's the one that came up and concocted this plan, conspired to, here, take Hagar and let her be your wife and give you a child because God promised you would have a child. So these are mistakes that she made. Yet through it all, she embodied the vow that she made to her husband, didn't she? Something that is spoken of in a sense of, you should know this most of the time in the Scriptures, but nevertheless, you look at Romans chapter 7. In Romans chapter 7, he's talking about how the law of Moses, you were married to that law at one point, but there's been a death now, and you're not under that law anymore. You're under the law of Christ today, under grace and so forth and all of that. But nevertheless, he uses an idea of marriage to describe that a woman is bound to her husband so long as he lives. And through all of those mistakes, all of those mishaps, all of those shortcomings, all of those wanderings about, the fact that he came home and said, honey, pack up, we're leaving. Where are we going? I don't know, but you're going to follow me. And she did. Powerful. Powerful message. She stayed faithful to him. She stayed true to him. So think about that. The only woman whose age is recorded in the Bible, because as the mother of the seed of promise, she became the mother of all believers. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 6. If you walk in the ways that are right, you're going to be like your mother, Sarah. You're going to be following in the footsteps of your mother, Sarah, in that sense. Abraham is given great prominence and given great recognition as a great character of the Bible. But Sarah was right there with him. Even though there were mistakes, absolutely. Abraham made mistakes as well. David made mistakes. Moses made mistakes. All made mistakes. But there's a difference in making mistakes and living a life of mistake. And these people were faithful, and they're noted for that. As I said, Hebrews 11, verse 11, she trusted in God who made her whole to have a child. Moses reminds us, though, of something as we read these verses, these couple of short verses, and there's not a lot said. The idea that here's Moses writes this about Abraham. Here's Abraham. He's giving us some great insight into how we can deal with these moments. Here he is feeling such loss, and sometimes try to read into something in the last phrase there in verse number 2, where it says Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her, that he wasn't there with her when she died. Most throw that out, and that's a misnomer here. He was there with her. He was just, the idea is he's there to mourn. He's there mourning the loss of his dear wife. They had a lot of years together, and, they were old, and you should expect that, right? It still hurt, didn't it? It says he came to mourn and to weep for her. And most commentaries and most historians will note that in that time frame, what this mourning, what this weeping process would probably look like would be something very drastically different than what we see today. They would pour dirt on their heads or dust on their heads. They would tear their clothes. They would fast. There's some of those things we see. People not necessarily choosing to fast, but because they're sad because of this loss, they choose not to eat. They can't think of eating. This is where he was. He was in that mindset. He was mourning. And he reminds us of this reality that Abraham and Sarah were human. Do you find yourself maybe sometimes separating from those people we read about in the Bible? Maybe saying, they just don't understand what it's like to be me. As we're trying to understand what it was like to be them. They're on a different level than we are. I'm no Abraham. I'm no Moses. I'm no Peter. I'm no Paul. They were just flesh and blood like you and I. No, I'm not going to get to live to be 147 years old, 127 years old, 137 years old, whatever. I'm not going to live to be 100, probably, just to be honest with you. But even if I did, I'm going to die. That's a reality. What then? Well, hopefully there's going to be some mourning. There's going to be some people, hopefully, that are sad that Barry died. I dare say family I know would be, as I would be if I lose some of my family. But we've got to keep going. Abraham faced the loss of the one he loved. Abraham reminds us not to count our mistakes and our setbacks and our losses, but embrace the reality that God has this. Embrace the reality that we can do this, even if sometimes we're facing a situation like this where we ask the question, how can I prepare for that? How can I be ready for this? Comes to us all, doesn't it? Look at Abraham as an example of facing loss, the loss of the one he loved. But number two, Abraham's faith helped him to move forward. And this is the transition part where we get into the faith aspect of this sermon. Abraham has been noted as being the father of the faithful. Or some have even said the father of faith somewhat. That he chose to listen to what God said and do it. And we've pointed out as we've read through this book the examples of mistakes, of falling short, of trying to go ahead of God at times. But we also see great victories where he was actually willing to do something so unthinkable, so unheard of as to sacrifice his own son. But remember, that was through faith. That was through faith and trusting and knowing that that son was a son of promise. That son was a son that came from God in the first place. If God gave him, God can take him back if he wants. But I want you to see something here. It's often said in the wake of a funeral, in the loss of a loved one, we often hear people sometimes say, God took them. And they're trying to find some comfort in the fact that God took them. This was the mindset, I dare say, that Abraham had, that God's going to take him back by my hand of killing him, but he's going to take him back. God's taking him. That's not biblical. There's two examples of that, and only two where that has taken place. Enoch and Elijah. The rest of us are going to leave this earth the same way. Death takes us. God receives us. I like that better. Don't you? It's semantics. It may be some semantics, but I can tell you what those semantics have caused some Christians to do, to leave God thinking God took this loved one of mine. No, if we're faithful and we die, death takes us from this world. God receives us. This is where Abraham was. My wife is dead. She's gone from me. So what do I do now? I have to move on. Abraham stood up. That's what the King James Version says. Abraham stood up. Look with me at verses 23. Chapter 23. Look with me at verses 3 through 4. And Abraham stood up from before his dead and spake unto the sons of Heth, saying, I am a stranger and a sojourner with you. Give me or sell me a possession of a burying place with you, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. He stood up. And I don't want to make too much out of that statement, but the idea here is one of respect. He stood up. It's time to carry on. And when I think about that, I have a reference on the screen of 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 20 through 23. In 2 Samuel 12, 20 through 23, if you recall the scene, David's son that he had with Bathsheba through that adulterous relationship, that murderously adulterous relationship, they have a son, and this son is dying. The whole time the child is sick and dying, David's doing what? He's mourning. He won't eat. He's fasting. He won't bathe. He's there by that child's side waiting on the inevitable. So the child dies. You recall the scene as you read in this text. They go to tell David. They're They're waiting, they're hesitating, they're uneasy about telling David because look at his situation. Look at the state of mind that he's been in all this time that the child was sick. If we tell him the child has died, it's going to kill the king. That's what they thought, literally. He can't take this. They didn't even get to really tell him, did they? David saw that. He realized what was going on, and he said, "Child's dead, right?" "Yes, the child has died." What does David do next? He gets up. Isn't that what the text says? He gets up, washes himself, bathes, gets something to eat, and they're all dumbfounded, right? How do you go from... They couldn't process it, could they? What was it? If you know anything about David, you know he's right there with Abraham and one of those that you would tie faith to him very closely, right? I can't bring him back. There's nothing that I can do to bring my son back to me, but I can go to him. And I will go to him. So it's time to get up. There's a time to mourn. There's a time for that. There's a time where it's important that we embrace that reality that we need to mourn. But there's also a time to move on. No, don't misunderstand what I'm saying here. Moving on in the sense of carrying on. We never forget them. Abraham certainly never forgot his wife either. He stood up. It's time to carry on. But as we continue reading, he stands before these people. It says, the men, the children of Heth. And Abraham, they answered Abraham in this sense. Look at verse 4 again. "I'm a stranger, I'm a sojourner with you." I'm a stranger, I'm an alien. I'm not one of the locals here, so to say. I'm a pilgrim, I'm a sojourner. I've been going throughout your land all this time. And it's interesting. Take note of this at this point. Abraham, at this age, he now has the son of promise. He's lost his wife. She died at 127 years old. He would have been 137 years old when she died. He was 10 years older than her. So he's had a long life. He's been wandering about. Isaac would have been somewhere around 36, I believe it is, somewhere around in that age. Somewhere around that at this point. So he's been wandering about this land for a long time. A land that God promised him, right? But he has not had any land to call his own. And he makes that clear here. I'm a sojourner with you. I don't have a place. I don't have a plot. Give me, which again I said sell because it's important when you look at the context. He's not asking for a handout here. Give me a portion. Give me a possession. Give me a burying place that I may bury my dead. And the children of Heth answered Abraham, saying unto him, Hear us, my Lord. Thou art a mighty prince among us. In the choice of our sepulchres bury thy dead. None of us shall withhold from thee his sepulchre, but that thou mayest bury thy dead. And Abraham again stood up. Respect. He stood up and bowed himself to the people of the land, even to the children of Heth. Showed reverence, showed respect. What we're seeing in this is faith is not arrogance. Abraham is noted in this context of being a man, a great prince among us, they said. They knew about Abraham's exploits. They knew how God was with Abraham, no doubt about that. Word traveled. 318 men. You remember he brought his family home. Brought down that uprising. He was a great man. He stood out. But he didn't use that. He didn't hold that over their heads. He stood up and he bowed before them. Verse 8 says, And he communed with them, saying, If it be your mind that I should bury my dead out of my sight, hear me, and entreat for me to Ephraim. Ephraim, a son of Zohar. He knew what he wanted, didn't he? He already knew what he was looking for. He came to the gates ready to do some business. And we're going to see that with the money that he has later on. But nevertheless, he comes and he says, he entreats, Bring out Ephraim, the son of Zohar, that he may give, and again I note, better translation, that he may sell me the cave of Machpelah, which he hath, which is in the end of his field. For as much money as it is worth, he shall give it me for a possession of a burying place amongst you. Ephraim heard this. He was there, verse 10, he was there among the people. He was a Hittite. Some say a Hethite is a better translation of that, and they talk about a lot of the commentaries. You go back and forth over the Hittite nation. People thought the Hittites really weren't a people until archaeology proved that they were. But it's important that you bring in this economy, because a lot of try to tie this economy of the Hittites to what takes place in this transaction. What Ephron is trying to say is, in essence, I'll give you this land, I'll give you this cave, I'll give you this portion, and it sounds so inviting and so much of a gift that I'm giving this to you, but he's expecting a gift in return that would be equal in value. And there's a lot of that happens today. You go overseas, in some places, some of the touristy places, take Rome for example, you may have a person come up to you and start talking about wanting to be your friend, and I've got this little trinket here, I got this little, you'd love this, isn't this cute? Wouldn't you like it? Here, this is a gift to you. Here, you can have this. Really? It's free? Yeah, you can have this. But just wait. What are you going to give me? I thought you said it was a gift. It is a gift. Yeah, it's free, but what are you going to give me? Oh, never mind. Here, you can have that back. They're not as friendly anymore when you give it back to them. But nevertheless, that's the idea, somewhat of the idea behind what he's trying to do. He answered Abraham in the audience of the children of Heth, even all that went in at the gate of his city, saying, and that's where the gate, that's where business transactions would take place. Nay, my Lord, hear me. The field I give thee, and the cave that is therein, I give it thee in the presence of the sons of my people. Give I it thee. Bury thy dead. Again, expecting somewhat of a gift in return. And Abraham, again, look at the humility. Sometimes we can come across as arrogant intentionally. And shame on us if we ever do that. Sometimes we can come across as arrogant unintentionally, and help us to recognize that. But here is a man showing, and he had all the authority in the world. They're praising him. They're exalting his name. You're a mighty prince among us. And what does he do? Abraham bowed down himself before the people of the land. And he spake unto Ephron and the audience of the people of the land, saying, But if thou wilt give it, I pray thee, hear me. I will give thee money for the field. Take it of me, and I will bury my dead there. And Ephron answered Abraham, saying, My Lord, hearken unto me. The land is worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that betwixt me and thee? Bury therefore thy dead. Most people think and agree that this 400 shekels of silver is an exuberant amount of money. It's kind of overcharging for that. But listen to the words of it again. And this tells you a little bit about Ephron. It also tells you a little bit about Abraham. What is that between you and me? Several commentaries that I looked at had this idea of saying, in essence, what's 400 shekels between someone as rich as you are and as rich as I am? You got the money. You got plenty of money. I got plenty of money. What's that between us? Go ahead. Take it. Now, the idea here behind the economy of the situation is it's going to bring up later on in the text, according to the customs, according to the weights and measures, according to the standards of money in that day and age. If Ephron had sold Abraham just the cave, many say that if you take the Hittite economy into consideration, if he'd sold him just the cave, he still had the field, he still had the trees, still all that, Ephron would be responsible for the taxation of all that land. So he wouldn't want to do that. He'd still be responsible for all of this. So he wants to sell him all of it. And you see it all come into play later on with the field, the trees, the cave, all of this. He gives him this whole plot of land. What is that between us? Ephron, according to one commentary noting this, he said, remarks a beautiful scene of politeness, simplicity, kindness, frankness, humility, modesty, not unmingled, with some shades of avarice, greed that is, and of a kind of expectation when one, in effect, is effecting a sale. He throws himself upon the generosity of the purchaser. He thinks, here comes a good sale. That's what this author was saying in essence. But Abraham, according to verses 6 and following, clearly was well known. Why not just take the plot? Why not just say, okay, maybe Abraham is shrewd and he knows all of this. But again, there's some assumptions that are being made whether or not this was the actual Hittite economy that we know of later on in history. Who knows for sure? But I know Abraham wasn't willing to just take this handout as a gift. Kind of reminds me of when David was offered Araunah's threshing floor for the house of the Lord, for the temple. He said, I will not offer anything to my God that doesn't cost me something. Many of you may have heard the name, if not heard him before, Brother V.P. Black. Heard that name? Shake your nod. Did a lot of preaching and teaching throughout the brotherhood, but also was known very much so for talking about giving. Preaching on giving and how we should be sacrificially giving as God would command us to do. And he made a statement about you can't really say you've given anything to the Lord if you haven't felt it. If you haven't missed it. What does he mean by that? He said you could give millions of dollars. Could you imagine coming one Sunday and someone putting $1 million in the plate? And you look back there on the board, offering 1 million and whatever the rest of the numbers would be. Wow. But put it in perspective. If I were to come in and give $1 million, you say, he done robbed the bank, something, what happened? Okay, he doesn't have that. You know that's not right. But if I were a billionaire and I came and I gave $1 million on Sunday, I wouldn't feel it. It'd be like some of us giving $1, right? I said some of us. Some people can squeeze that $5 bill till Lincoln squeals, right? But the idea of not feeling it. Abraham said, no, I'm going to buy this. This is going to be for me. And a word that I've read over a few times, I have it underlined in my Bible. I think it might do you well to focus on it. If you don't want to underline it, if you don't mark in your Bibles, that's fine, but at least make a note of this. Be for me a what? A possession. I own this. A place for me to bury my wife. But he didn't say my wife, he said to bury my dead. Because it's not going to be just a tomb for his wife. It's going to be a tomb for him, for his son, and so forth. A place, a family burial place. But it's going to be a possession of mine. Now, when you think about that, Abraham didn't allow the grief or his ego even to make him beholden to anyone but the Lord. See, in that grief, that might be easy for me in that grief to say, really? You're going to give that to me? Oh, thank you. How kind. But then later on, he might be beholden to Ephron. And he says, don't you remember what I did for you? Now, what are you going to do for me in this situation? And it may be something immoral and a compromising situation. He says, no, I'm not going to do that. Do you remember when Abraham grabbed his 300 servants and they went to fight against the 4 kings? He brings back the spoils. He brings back the spoils of Sodom. He brings back his nephew and the families and the women and the children and so forth. And the kings of Sodom and so forth, they start saying, hey, we're going to give you some money. So I don't want it. I don't want anything from you. I've got my family. Just what's mine. That's all I want. I don't want to be beholden to you. He said that, in essence. Same's true here. He didn't allow his grief or his ego to make him beholden to anyone but the Lord. It's time to move forward. He's still mourning. He's still suffering the loss of his wife. Absolutely. But it's time to move forward and keep before him the promise of God. How do I prepare for this? Abraham purchased a field, the cave, and the trees, all the trees. We see that in verses 17 through 20. Go ahead and read that together. And the field of Ephron, which was in Machpelah, which was before Mamre, the field and the cave which was therein, and all the trees that were in the field, that were in all the borders round about, were made sure. Whether it was an actual written deed that was given to him, it was confirmed that it now belongs to him. It was made sure unto Abraham for a possession in the presence of the children of Heth before all that went in at the gate of the city. Everything was legal, everything was binding. And then there's a summary statement made in verses 19 and 20, repeating it. And after this, Abraham buried Sarah his wife in the cave of the field of Machpelah before Mamre, which the same is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. Before Mamre, east of Mamre, in the side of Mamre, looking toward Mamre, in the land of Canaan. Does that remind you of something? It reminds me of the promise. The promise that we read back in chapter 12, starting out, get thee from thy family, from thy father's kindred, to a land that I will show thee. I'll make of thee a great nation. I'll bless him who blesses you. I'll curse him who curses you. Through your seed all nations will be blessed. All that. But he also tells him in chapter 12, going through chapter 23 or chapter 12, verses 4 through 7 specifically, he tells him that that land is going to be his possession. His seed's possession. And through all of this time that Abraham has been wandering, from the time he was called out of his home in Ur, he's called out of Haran as well, Abraham's been preparing for this moment. Genesis 12 through 23. Mistakes caused him to realize his need for God. His successes caused him to trust in God. And he and Sarah have now the son of promise, Isaac. And now, though he's lost the love of his life, he now has actual ownership in the land of promise. It's interesting how God's timing is seldom ours, but how He always can make it happen. God has this, brothers and sisters. You and I, we can do this. And Abraham helps show us how to prepare for even some of the most difficult and darkest moments, even death. We have to stand up. We have to move forward. We have to trust in God. You're here this morning. You've heard the Word of God. Do you believe Jesus is the Son of God? Can you and I honestly sing this next song with confidence that when that roll is called up yonder, we will be there? We're going to be there for the judgment, but we'll be there with God. Look at how God was with Abraham. Look at how God was with those great patriarchs we read about in the Old Testament, those prophets we read about in the Old Testament, how God was with the people when Jesus came to show His love for you and me. Will you be baptized into Christ for the remission of your sins? Will you be faithful to Him? If we can help in any way, will you come right now as we stand?